I'd like to especially thank the University of Florida for the kind welcome and the very good treatment we've had. I've even had a chance today to visit an absolutely wonderful butterfly exhibit, which wasn't the kind of thing historians of the Middle East usually get to do, and I loved it. I especially want to thank Altan and the other members of the Turkish Student Association for all their hard work in putting this together, and I want to congratulate him on the eloquence of his speech. I'm afraid that it's the last bit of eloquence you're going to hear this evening, because you've invited a history professor to give a talk. And history professors tend to give history classes, which is what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to talk to you about an unfortunate topic, which is the topic of genocide. The question I'm going to consider is, was there a genocide of the Armenians? And I have to give you a warning, and that is that history is complicated. In this subject, too often we get slogans, we get accusations, we get threats. The truth actually is found in details. History is always proven by the details. Avoiding the details makes for much more interesting talks, but obscures the truth. So I can't promise you fascination, but I think I can promise you lots of details. First, taking a look at what genocide is. As we look at it, we find that no one really knows. It's one of those words that's used all the time and is almost never understood. If you see the two sets of definitions in front of you, or the three, I'm sorry, you'll notice that the main one, the one that is most commonly talked about, is the definition of the United Nations. And you'll notice that the United Nations talks about killing people. It talks about doing them serious bodily or mental harm. Mental harm is something that's exceedingly difficult to define. It talks about inflicting all sorts of conditions on people, many of which are nasty. But the most important thing it says, as you can see in the second line there, that this is in intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Down below we have another definition. The deliberate destruction of physical life of individual human beings. Or in other words, one person. One person being killed because you don't like what that person is under these definitions, genocide. And down below, genocide is any act that puts the very existence of a group in jeopardy. Any act. One might say that polluting the water would count as genocide in this kind of definition. And indeed, it would be. Then there are the other definitions, the definitions that describe not the theory of genocide, but what people think it actually is. The definition that says it is a form of one-sided mass killing, in other words, there can't be two groups of killers, in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group. And down below, as you can see from the second definition, the group that is going to be destroyed has to be essentially defenseless. In other words, this is what people think of when they think of genocide. When people mention the word genocide, they think of Hitler. They think of what Hitler did to the Jews, and I think probably they're right in doing so. The two basic questions we have to ask about the Turks, the Armenians, and genocide is, first of all, were the Armenians innocent, or were they combatants in a war? Secondly, did the Ottomans intend to destroy them? In order to take a look at the situation, we first should get some idea of the population of the area we're talking about. This is really important in the whole debate about Turks and Armenians. You'll notice that the Muslims are the green and the Armenians are the red. This is the population immediately before all the troubles of World War I. This is the population the way it was. The reason we say Muslims rather than Turks or Kurds is because the census kept records by religion. In the Ottoman Empire, that was the way they did things. The people who tell you they know how many people were Turks, how many were Kurds, are just making it up. But when you look at this, you can see that very obviously the Armenians were a very distinct minority. And that if you were to create some place called Armenia out of this section of Anatolia, and these are the sections that are claimed by Armenians at the time, if you were to do this, you would have the rule of a minority over a majority. You would have an apartheid state. But what we're mainly concerned about here is not who was there before, but what happened during the war. And for that, we're mainly concerned with the relocation of the Armenians. Oftentimes the word deportation is used, it's used wrongly, because a deportation is evicting someone from one country and sending them to another. And this, of course, was a movement of Armenians from one part of the Ottoman Empire to another part of the Ottoman Empire. The question that we have is why? In this area, which we call Anatolia at the time, before Turkey existed, in this area, why did they relocate the Armenians? Did they have an evil intention, or was there some kind of reason to do so? The Ottomans felt they had to deport the Armenians. They felt they had good reason, because the Armenians were their enemies. And the question is, were they correct? Well, one of the reasons you can find whether they were correct or not is by looking at the declarations of the two main Armenian groups that opposed the Ottomans, the Hunchak Party and the Dashnak Party. If you simply read these declarations, you will notice that they both talk about forcible popular revolt. In other words, revolt of Armenians against the Ottoman government. You'll notice that they talk about insurrection. You'll notice that they talk about a people's war against the Turkish government. They say people's war because they're communists, and that's the kind of terminology that they like to use. The revolutionary groups thus made very plain that they were planning on revolting against the Ottoman government. And they made very plain at the time that they were going to take the side of Russia when there was a war between the Turks and the Russians, and that they were going to fight on the side of the Russians. Just before the war began, British diplomats, who were not especially friendly to Turkey and were about to go to war with Turkey, British diplomats reported that the Armenians were all tremendously well armed, that they had more arms than the Kurds, and the Kurds were fairly well armed. But they were more well armed than the Kurds, and that they were planning on going to Russia. They were planning on joining the Russians in a fight against the Turks, which, when the war began, is indeed what they did. In the entire light green region that you see there, the Ottoman secret forces, the spies that they had in the area, they reported that all of the Armenian young men of military age who could not be forcibly caught and brought into the army because they were expected to be conscripted, that all of them had left and gone, some to Iran, but mostly to Russia. Now, it was a slight exaggeration, but not much of an exaggeration. The exaggeration came because they hadn't all gone to Russia. Many of them had stayed behind and formed gangs, guerrilla gangs, or what we call partisan gangs. They had formed gangs with the intention of attacking the Ottomans. They had started doing this before the war began, actually about 2.5 months before the war began, in anticipation that the war would begin. When the war did begin, Armenian rebellions broke out all over the eastern part of Anatolia, that you can see with the rifles. All over. And the effect they had was colossal. Here we're using the geography and the maps to talk about this, but I stress to you that we have a tremendous amount of detail, a tremendous amount of reporting on what was actually done by these groups. There are two main points we have to consider. First of all, that the Armenians were acting as agents of Russia, as agents of the enemies of the Ottomans during wartime, or in other words, that they were traitors. Secondly, that the Ottomans had good reason to fear the Armenians and good reason to take action to protect themselves, their government, and their people against these revolutionaries. The Ottomans reacted to treason because they knew they could expect more treason. While we're considering these rebellions, there are three factors we have to understand and think about. Military factors: supply, communication, and, unfortunately for the Ottomans, retreat when they're defeated. To do that, I want to look at certain areas in the eastern part of Anatolia where the wars took place. Specifically, I want to talk about roads, and I want to talk about transportation, and then later on to say a few words about retreat. There were two fronts that the Ottomans fought on. And I told them I would try not to get away from the microphone, but I have to do a little here. Over here, we have the Iranian front. At the beginning of the war, and even before, the Russians had come down from here, and they had moved down into Iran, and they controlled this entire section of Iran. And up here, of course, we have the frontier between the Ottoman Empire and Russia, in which there was the strongest and the fiercest of the fighting. You can